The soft hum of the airport terminal wrapped around the Lambert family like a familiar melody. One that signified both movement and possibility. For Daniel Lambert, a tenacious human rights attorney who had spent decades battling injustices in courtrooms across the world, this moment felt almost surreal. Beside him, his wife, Elena, an esteemed professor whose groundbreaking research on social equity had earned her international recognition, adjusted the strap of her bag while stealing a glance at their teenage son. Miles. At 16, Miles stood on the precipice of adulthood, his eyes brimming with the kind of curiosity only a young mind could hold. He had grown up watching his parents dedicate their lives to causes greater than themselves, long nights spent drafting policy recommendations, impassioned debates over dinner, the quiet exhaustion in their eyes after another hard-won battle. Yet, despite their unwavering commitment to justice, moments like these, where it was just the three of them, together, away from the weight of their responsibilities, were rare. Too rare. This vacation had been meticulously planned, not just as a getaway but as a reward, a testament to their sacrifices and triumphs, to the struggles that had defined their journey, a chance to breathe. As they approached the first-class check-in counter, Miles' eyes darted around, absorbing the details with a mix of awe and disbelief. The lounge area, adorned with plush seating and polished wooden accents, exuded an air of exclusivity. Passengers dressed in sleek business attire sipped steaming espressos, their conversations hushed and sophisticated, the scent of freshly brewed coffee intertwined with the crisp scent of leather seats, mingling with the quiet efficiency of attendants who moved with practiced precision. It was a world he had only glimpsed in passing, one of polished surfaces and whispered indulgences. But today, they belonged here, and yet, part of him couldn't help but feel as though he were stepping into something unreal. A space he had only imagined. Is this really our line? He whispered, the question carrying a mixture of disbelief and excitement. Daniel chuckled, resting a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Yes, son, we've come a long way. Those words held an entire lifetime within them. The late nights spent poring over case files in dimly lit offices. The conferences Elena had traveled to, where she presented her work to skeptical audiences who questioned the necessity of her research. The lean years when money was tight, and vacations were nothing more than a distant dream. There had been times when exhaustion had pressed so heavily upon them that it felt almost impossible to keep going. But they had, together. The check-in attendant, a young woman with a warm smile, greeted them with effortless professionalism. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Lambert. We've been expecting you. Here are your boarding passes. Feel free to enjoy the first-class lounge before your flight boards. Miles leaned in slightly, eyes gleaming with an enthusiasm that was impossible to contain. This is amazing, he murmured, causing the attendant to grin. First time flying first class? She asked knowingly. He nodded enthusiastically, his grin stretching wider. Yes, ma'am, I can't wait to see what it's like. Daniel and Elena exchanged a look, their hearts swelling at their son's unguarded joy. This was what they had worked for, not luxury, not extravagance, but the simple ability to provide these experiences, to show him a world they had fought to reach. As they made their way through security and into the exclusive first-class lounge, a hush fell over them. The contrast between the bustling main terminal and this oasis of tranquility was striking. Soft lighting cast a golden glow over the space, highlighting sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the tarmac. Servers moved through the lounge carrying trays of refreshments, their presence unobtrusive yet attentive. Miles' gaze roamed over the expansive seating area, the high-end espresso machines, the delicate arrangement of gourmet snacks. He took in every detail as if committing it to memory. They settled into a corner, their seats plush and inviting. Elena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a near whisper. Can you believe it? 10 years ago, we were scraping by, wondering if we'd ever be able to do something like this. Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. We've come a long way, honey. Together. Their journey had never been easy. There had been countless obstacles, moments of doubt, times when they had questioned whether the sacrifices were worth it. But sitting here, watching their son take in a world they had worked so hard to step into, it was impossible to feel anything but gratitude. Miles, completely absorbed in the experience, toggled through the seat controls, adjusting the recline and marveling at the hidden compartments. His delight was unfiltered, pure. "This is incredible," he breathed, fingers tracing the edges of the in-flight entertainment screen. Elena laughed softly, shaking her head. "Just don't accidentally eject yourself from the plane, okay?" Daniel smiled, though beneath the warmth, a quiet sense of awareness lingered. They were being watched, subtly, discreetly, but watched nonetheless. It wasn't hostility, necessarily, just a curiosity that carried undertones of something else. A few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, disbelief? But Daniel refused to let it sour the moment. They had earned this, every single bit of it. As the flight was called for boarding, they joined the queue of first-class passengers, stepping onto the plane and into a world of quiet luxury. The spacious cabin, the plush leather seats, the private partitions, each detail was designed for comfort and exclusivity. Miles practically bounced into his window seat, his fingers hovering over the array of controls. "Wow," he murmured, "this is unreal." Elena settled beside him, her gaze soft. "Enjoy it, sweetheart. You deserve this." Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the years slip from his shoulders. This trip wasn't just about leisure. It was about reclaiming time, celebrating resilience, and embracing the space they had carved out for themselves. He glanced at Elena, their fingers brushing lightly, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had built. A life defined not just by struggle, but by triumph. A life where, finally, they could pause, just for a little while, and breathe. The elegant stillness of the first-class cabin was a stark contrast to the restless energy of the main terminal. The Lambert family had settled into their seats, their hearts full, their minds ready to embrace the journey ahead. Miles, his teenage enthusiasm bubbling over, continued exploring the amenities with wide-eyed wonder, fingers skimming across the polished surface of the armrest controls. Daniel and Elena exchanged a glance, one filled with quiet joy. A silent acknowledgement of the years of hard work that had led them here. This was their moment, a rare escape from their grueling lives as advocates for justice. A moment of luxury they had earned, not through privilege, but through persistence. But then, like the slow roll of distant thunder, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. A woman entered the first-class section, moving with the kind of self-assured grace that came from years of navigating spaces built for the elite. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored designer ensemble untouched by the weariness that clung to most travelers. Her name was Victoria Langley, a woman accustomed to the unspoken hierarchies that governed the world of the privileged. And as her gaze swept across the cabin, taking inventory of the passengers who shared this rarefied space with her, her eyes landed on the Lamberts. Something in her expression changed. It was subtle, the shift, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening of the lips, but Daniel caught it immediately. He had seen it before. For a moment, she simply stood there, the leather strap of her Louis Vuitton bag clutched a little tighter in her manicured fingers. It was a second, perhaps two, of hesitation, a moment where the weight of her assumptions warred with the reality before her. And then she moved, her heels clicking sharply against the plush carpet as she made her way to the nearest flight attendant. Her voice, though lowered, was laced with something sharp, insistent, and unmistakably pointed. "Excuse me," she began, her tone perfectly poised between entitlement and thinly veiled irritation. "I believe there may have been a mistake." The young flight attendant, trained in the delicate dance of accommodating high-paying passengers, straightened immediately, her smile unwavering. "How can I assist you, ma'am?" Victoria inclined her head ever so slightly toward Daniel, Elena, and Miles. She didn't even say their names, didn't bother addressing them directly. Instead, she let her voice drop into an exaggerated whisper, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That family," she murmured. "I believe they may be in the wrong section. Could you check their tickets? First class is rather exclusive." "You see." Daniel's breath stilled. Elena's fingers, wrapped around her complimentary champagne flute, clenched ever so slightly. Miles, oblivious at first, looked up just in time to see the flight attendant's faltering smile. It was in that moment, that fragile, suspended moment between confrontation and confirmation, that the world tilted just enough to remind them of where they stood. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant replied, her professionalism straining against the discomfort creeping into her features. All passengers here have been properly seated. Victoria's lips pressed together in a thin, disbelieving line. Are you certain? She pressed, her voice carrying through the cabin now. Because I have flown first class for years. And I know when something is out of place. Something tightened in Daniel's chest. He wasn't just a man on vacation anymore. He was a lawyer, a fighter, a father. He had spent years standing in courtrooms, pushing back against policies and systems that thrived on exclusion. He had fought for families who had been turned away, for clients who had been denied what was rightfully theirs. And yet, in this moment, his own presence, his family's presence, was being challenged, diminished, dismissed. Elena spoke first, her voice even, yet carrying the weight of unspoken history. We paid for our seats. Just like you. Victoria blinked, as if hearing Elena's voice for the first time. She hadn't expected a response. She hesitated, but then straightened, unwilling to let go of her manufactured outrage. I only meant that. You only meant to say. Daniel cut in, his tone calm but razor sharp. That people like us don't belong here. A hush fell over the cabin. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others watched with undisguised interest. This was no longer a quiet conversation between a privileged woman and an airline employee. It was something bigger. Victoria scoffed, shaking her head. Oh, don't twist my words, she spat, but the telltale flush of exposure crept up her neck. It's just unexpected. That's all. Unexpected. The word hung between them like a verdict. Elena exhaled slowly, her eyes locked onto Victoria's. Unexpected for you, she murmured, but not for us. Not anymore. The impact of her words rippled outward. Victoria's carefully constructed facade wavered, her shoulders stiffening as she truly realized, that she had miscalculated. A man in a suit a few rows back cleared his throat, his voice carrying in the silence. Mr. Lambert, he said, almost cautiously, aren't you the attorney who won the Kessler case last year? Daniel turned slightly, acknowledging the man with a small nod. Yes, he said simply. And Professor Elena Lambert, a woman 2 seats away, added, sitting up straighter, recognition dawning. I've read your work on social equity. Brilliant research. The shift was instantaneous. Passengers who had remained silent now saw the Lamberts in a different light, not just as a family subjected to prejudice, but as people of stature, of intellect, of worth. The weight of Victoria's assumption now lay solely on her shoulders. And for the first time, she had nothing to say. The flight attendant, sensing the moment had turned, gave Victoria a polite but firm smile. Ma'am, please return to your seat. And with that, Victoria Langley was left with nothing but silence. A silence she would carry for the rest of the flight. And perhaps, for much longer than that. For Daniel Lambert, confrontation was not new. It was woven into the very fabric of his career. His identity, his purpose, as a human rights lawyer. He had built his life on the foundation of fighting for those who had been dismissed, marginalized, or stripped of their dignity by systems designed to silence them. But here, in the plush leather seat of first class, next to his wife Elena and their teenage son Miles, he found himself facing a different kind of battle, one that was insidious, unspoken yet heavy, a confrontation that pressed against the air like an approaching storm. A battle he had not expected to fight on what was supposed to be a long overdue family trip. The tension had settled into the first-class cabin the moment Victoria Langley, with her impeccably styled bob and entitled air, had muttered the words that now lingered, hanging in the space between them like a wound left open. People like them don't belong here. The words had been spoken just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to be deniable. Cowardice masquerading as civility. Elena stiffened beside him. She was no stranger to these moments. But knowing that Miles was witnessing it, feeling it, made it so much worse. The young boy, who had been gleefully exploring the functions of his reclining seat only moments before, now sat still, confusion knitting his brows, his excitement draining away. His world, previously untouched by the sharp edges of discrimination, had just shifted in a way he had yet to fully understand. Daniel felt his pulse steady. A calm, deliberate resolve settled over him. He had learned, after years in the courtroom, that anger was easy, but dignity was powerful. And power, real power, wasn't about shouting down an enemy. It was about standing tall in the face of someone trying to make you feel small. He turned, his gaze locking onto Victoria's. His voice steady, measured, not a challenge, not an apology, simply truth. "Ma'am," he said, his tone even but unmistakably firm. "We paid for our seats. Just like everyone else. We belong here." A silence followed, thick, charged, expectant. Victoria's lips thinned as she shifted in her seat, as if searching for the right words to justify herself. Justify the unjustifiable. She scoffed, shaking her head. But Daniel saw it. The flicker of something behind her carefully crafted arrogance. Uncertainty. Exposure. Miles, his voice tentative but insistent, spoke up beside him. "Dad, why is she saying we don't belong?" Elena inhaled sharply. This was the moment parents dreaded. The one where a child's innocence collided with the world's reality. Where the unspoken rules, the invisible biases, became suddenly, painfully clear. She had always known this day would come, but not like this. Not here. She turned toward her son, reaching for his hand. Her grip was warm, steady, anchoring him in the middle of this storm. "Miles, listen to me," she said gently, her voice carrying the kind of strength that did not waver, even in the face of prejudice. "There are people in this world who will look at us and decide, before they know anything about us, that we don't belong, not because of anything we've done, but because of what they think they know." Miles frowned, his fingers tightening around hers. "But that's not fair," he said, his voice thick with something Elena recognized as the beginning of understanding, the kind that steals away pieces of childhood far too soon. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, "it's not." Daniel exhaled slowly, turning back to Victoria, who had sunk further into her seat, her hands clenched in her lap. She had wanted to make them small. Instead, she had been made to look at herself. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had once been silent were now paying attention. A young woman with a journalist's keen eyes discreetly lifted her phone, capturing the moment. A moment that would later travel far beyond the confines of this plane, sparking conversations in places Victoria never intended. Across the aisle, an older man, a silver-haired businessman in a crisp navy suit, leaned forward slightly. Addressing Daniel, "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a note of recognition. "Are you Daniel Lambert, the lawyer who won the Marshall case last year?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. A flicker of surprise crossed the man's face, followed by something softer. "I thought I recognized you," the businessman murmured. He turned his gaze toward Elena. "And you, Professor Elena Lambert. My daughter studied your work on racial equity last semester. She spoke about you constantly." The shift was instantaneous. The whispers among the passengers grew. Eyes that had once regarded them with uncertainty, skepticism, or simple indifference were now filled with something else: recognition, understanding, respect. Victoria, who had been so sure of her position only moments before, looked stricken. She had miscalculated, she had assumed, and she had been proven wrong. Daniel held her gaze, offering her one final chance to apologize, to acknowledge, to change. But Victoria only looked away. The flight attendant, who had been watching carefully, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said, her voice polite but resolute, "I'd appreciate it if we could allow all passengers to enjoy their flight in peace." A warning, a closing of the door. And with that, it was over. Victoria sat back, her face flushed, her hands still gripping the edges of her seat. She did not speak again for the rest of the flight. Elena let out a slow breath. Turning back to Miles, she ran her fingers through his curls, offering him a reassuring smile. "Are we okay, Mom?" he asked softly. She met Daniel's eyes, her partner, her anchor, the man who had faced every battle at her side, and then looked back at her son. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, with all the certainty in the world. "We are more than okay." Because dignity was not given. It was owned. And tonight, they had carried it with them. Untarnished, unshaken, no matter who had tried to take it away. For a moment, the cabin was silent, a silence so thick it felt like a held breath. The weight of unspoken words pressing against the walls of first class. The confrontation between Daniel Lambert and Victoria Langley had played out like a scene in a courtroom, one side armed with quiet dignity, the other with entitlement masquerading as certainty. But now, something had shifted. It started small, a single voice, hesitant yet filled with something undeniable. "Excuse me." A man's voice carried through the cabin. Daniel turned, his composure still intact, though his eyes held the quiet fire of a man who had spent years fighting battles in places where his presence had been questioned. The voice belonged to a silver-haired gentleman, a distinguished man in a navy suit, his face lined with age but sharp with intelligence. "Are you Daniel Lambert?" the man asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Recognition flickered across the man's face. "I thought so," he said, with an air of respect. "I read about your work. Your case last year, it changed everything." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A young woman 2 seats back sat up straighter, her eyes bright with realization. "Professor Elena Lambert?" she said, looking toward Elena. Elena, who had remained calm, unwavering beside her husband, turned toward the speaker. "Yes," she responded, her voice steady, but now tinged with curiosity. "I studied your research on racial equity," the young woman said, her words rushed with admiration. "Your work helped shape my thesis. I've been following you for years." And just like that, the tide turned. Passengers who had been watching in uncomfortable silence now saw the Lamberts not as intruders, but as something else entirely, people of substance, of brilliance, of unshakable worth. It was as if, in that moment, their presence was not just acknowledged but validated in the eyes of those who had doubted them. Victoria Langley, once so sure of her words, sank deeper into her seat. The color in her face drained, her fingers gripping the armrest as though she could disappear into the leather. But the shift was not just happening inside the cabin. It was happening outside of it. Because amidst the murmurs, the whispered apologies, and the stunned recognition, one passenger had captured everything. The young woman who had spoken earlier, the student who had admired Elena's work, held her phone just low enough to remain unobtrusive, but high enough to see. She had recorded the moment Victoria had questioned the Lamberts' presence. She had recorded Daniel's quiet, powerful response. She had recorded Miles' confused, innocent question, the heartbreaking realization on his face. And now, with the tap of her finger, she sent it out into the world. The video took flight before the plane did. By the time the aircraft touched the sky, the footage was circulating online, traveling at a speed far beyond the limits of physical distance. It was shared first by students, those who had followed Elena's work, who had read Daniel's cases, who saw in them something greater than themselves. Then it spread to journalists, to activists, to people who had never heard of the Lamberts but who recognized the weight of the moment. People who had sat in restaurants, in meeting rooms, in taxis, hearing whispers of the same sentiment Victoria had spoken aloud. People like them don't belong here. The phrase struck a nerve. By the time the flight landed, the video had reached tens of thousands of viewers. By the time the Lamberts walked through the airport terminal, the number had grown into the millions. And waiting for them, just beyond the baggage claim, past the weary travelers and blinking arrival boards, were the cameras. A wall of reporters, microphones raised. The world had seen. The world had listened. And now, the world was waiting. Daniel and Elena stopped in their tracks, their fingers instinctively linking together as they absorbed the scene before them. "Mr. Lambert," a journalist pushed forward, her eyes alight with urgency. "Can you comment on what happened during your flight?" "Professor Lambert," another voice called out, "the video of your confrontation is going viral. Do you think incidents like this are common?" Daniel exchanged a look with Elena. They had spent their lives fighting battles with their voices, with their knowledge, with their integrity. They had taught Miles to stand tall, to walk with dignity, to never shrink in the presence of ignorance. Now, the world was watching, so they did what they had always done. They stood, they faced the cameras, and they spoke. What happened today is something that happens far more often than people realize. Elena said, her voice clear, unwavering. "Our story is just one of many. The only difference is that this time, people saw it unfold in real time." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. "Bias is not always loud," he said. "Sometimes, it's a whisper, a glance, a hesitation, but it exists, and the only way we change that is by acknowledging it, by refusing to look away." A hush fell over the press, because they knew, this was more than just a viral video. This was a movement, a call to see, a call to listen, a call to stand, and far beyond the airport, Beyond the flashing cameras and the churning headlines, people were watching their screens, reading their words, sharing their message, not just because it was a story, but because it was the truth. A truth that could no longer be ignored. The world felt different now. It wasn't supposed to. For Victoria Langley, life had always been a carefully curated sequence of events, planned, controlled, predictable. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention in any room. The kind who knew exactly how the world worked, or at least, she had thought she did. But now, everything had changed. She sat alone in the dimly lit corner of an upscale cafe, stirring her coffee, though she wasn't drinking it. The steam curled into the air like a whisper, silent but heavy, much like the weight pressing against her chest. Her manicured fingers traced the rim of the cup absent-mindedly as her mind replayed the moment on the plane. Over and over again, like a scene she couldn't escape. She had been so certain. She had been so sure she was right. When she had walked onto that plane, she hadn't seen a family. She had seen an anomaly. Something that didn't fit. Something that made her uncomfortable. Though she had never stopped to ask herself why. And then, the fallout. The whispers. The murmurs. The looks. And then, the phone screens. The recording had spread like wildfire. By the time she landed, it had already reached hundreds of thousands of people. And within hours, it had gone viral. Her name wasn't in the caption. But it didn't need to be. People knew. The comments poured in. Sharp. Unfiltered. Unforgiving. This is why racism still exists. Privilege in action. Look at her face when she realizes she's wrong. Entitlement at its finest. She couldn't stand to see a successful black family in first class. Disgusting. Shame on her. The words sliced through her like 1,000 tiny knives. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. For years, she had never questioned herself. She had never needed to. But now, she couldn't stop. Her carefully built world, the one where she was always on the right side of things, was crumbling beneath her. She had spent the past few days scrolling through comment sections, searching for something, anything, to justify what she had done. But there was nothing. Nothing except the undeniable, uncomfortable truth staring her in the face. She had been wrong, and she had never been forced to sit with that truth before. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain mug. What now? A part of her wanted to run from this. To disappear. To delete her accounts and pretend it never happened. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't erase what she had done. It wouldn't change anything. And maybe, for the first time, she needed to change. The realization burned in her chest. A mixture of shame and something else. Something she didn't yet have a name for. She wasn't a bad person. At least, she had never thought she was. But wasn't that the problem? That people like her, privileged, comfortable, sheltered in their own worldview, never thought they were part of the issue? That they always assumed their discomfort was justified, never questioning where it came from. For the first time, Victoria saw herself clearly. And she didn't like what she saw. With a shaky breath, she reached into her bag, pulling out her notebook, the same one she used for planning fundraisers, making lists, organizing her perfect life. But this time, her pen hovered over the page for a long time before she wrote anything. Finally, with slow, deliberate strokes, she began, "Things I need to unlearn." She sat there for nearly an hour, writing down everything, every unconscious bias, every assumption she had made about people who didn't look like her. Every moment she had dismissed as not her problem. And when she finished, she stared at the words, her own handwriting staring back at her like a confession. This wasn't enough. She needed to do more. 2 days later, she walked into a diversity and inclusion workshop, one she had ignored countless times before. She sat in the back, her arms crossed tightly at first, her jaw clenched, but as the speaker began, her words piercing but necessary, Victoria felt something inside her shift. "We don't just inherit privilege," the speaker said, "we uphold it, whether we realize it or not. And if we aren't questioning it, if we aren't working to undo the harm it has caused, then we are part of the problem." For the first time, Victoria understood. This was bigger than her. It had always been bigger than her. She didn't know if an apology would be enough, or if the Lamberts would even want to hear from her. She didn't expect forgiveness. But that didn't mean she wouldn't try. And so, she wrote the email. To Daniel Lambert. Subject: an apology. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't justify. She didn't defend. She simply told the truth. I have spent the past few days reflecting on my actions. And I want to start by saying I am deeply sorry for what I did. At the time, I didn't realize the weight of my words, the harm in my assumptions. But now, I do. And I know that being sorry isn't enough. I need to be better. I want to be better. Your family taught me a lesson I should have learned a long time ago. And I won't forget it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I am committed to unlearning the biases that led me to that moment. I hope one day, I can be the kind of person who stands up for others the way you stood up for yourself. When she hit send, she exhaled, her hands trembling. She didn't know what would come next. Maybe nothing, maybe everything, but for the first time in a long time, Victoria Langley wasn't running from the truth. She was facing it, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward becoming someone worth forgiving. What do you think? Do you believe Victoria deserves a second chance? Should she try to meet the Lamberts in person? Or would that be crossing the line? Comment below and share your thoughts, because growth begins with conversation. For Miles Lambert, the world had always been simple. Not easy, not perfect, but simple. He had grown up believing in fairness, in the idea that if you worked hard, did your best, and treated people with kindness, the world would reflect that kindness back. His parents had taught him that. His mother, Elena, spent her days teaching students about the power of social justice. His father, Daniel, fought legal battles that changed lives. They were his heroes, the kind of people who stood for something bigger than themselves. But nothing had prepared him for what happened on that plane. Nothing had prepared him for the way a stranger could look at his family and decide, in an instant, that they didn't belong. Sitting in first class had felt like stepping into a dream, soft leather seats, endless buttons to press, the quiet hum of luxury all around them. But then, the woman, the whisper, the tightening in his mother's shoulders, the way his father's voice had changed, calm, but sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk, and the way it made him feel, small, confused, exposed. He could still hear the words echoing in his head. People like them don't belong here. At first, he didn't understand. Not really. His family wasn't loud or disruptive. They weren't doing anything wrong. So why? Dad, why is she saying we don't belong? Even now, long after the plane had landed, the question sat heavy in his chest. He thought about it when they walked through the airport. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting his parents' names. He thought about it when they reached their hotel. When he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. His mother's words had stuck with him. Sometimes people judge others not because of who they are, but because of what they've been taught to believe. That wasn't fair. That wasn't right. And the worst part? This wasn't new to them. His parents had been here before. They had lived this, fought this, carried this. They weren't even surprised. That's what hurt the most. The next morning, he sat across from his father at breakfast, watching him read emails on his phone. Calm, composed, unbothered. How do you do it? Miles asked, his voice small. Daniel looked up. Do what? Stay calm, not get angry. Because if it had been him, if someone had looked at him and assumed he wasn't good enough, he would have shouted. He would have fought back. His father set his phone down, studying him with that look, the one he always gave when he was about to say something important. Anger is easy, son. It burns fast, and then it's gone. But dignity? He tapped the table for emphasis. Dignity stays. Miles frowned. But what if people don't deserve that? Daniel's smile was small, tired. Then you show them anyway. His mother reached over, brushing his curls from his forehead. Because who we are isn't determined by how people see us. It's determined by how we see ourselves. Miles didn't answer, because he wasn't sure what he wanted to say. A lesson in strength. Later that afternoon, as they explored the city, people recognized them. A shopkeeper shook his father's hand, thanking him for his work. A young woman approached his mother, telling her how her research had inspired her. Even online, Miles saw the way people were talking about them, praising his parents for standing their ground, for handling the situation with grace. He should have been proud. And he was. But he also felt something else. A weight, a realization, that this wasn't just one moment on a plane. This was something his parents had carried their whole lives. They had built their careers on fighting battles like these, not with fists, not with shouting, but with words, with action, with resilience. And Miles? He had never really thought about it before. Not like this. The turning point. That night, in the hotel room, he sat with his laptop open, reading through the flood of messages. Some were encouraging, others were angry, defending the woman on the plane, saying his family was overreacting. And then, one comment stopped him cold. This was a wake-up call for me. I never thought about how deep these biases run. But watching that video changed something. I want to do better. It was small. One person. One change. But Miles felt it. Felt the shift. The impact. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that's why his parents fought so hard. Because every conversation, every moment of grace, had the power to change someone. Even if it was just one person at a time. A new resolve. As they packed their bags to head home, Miles felt different. Not older. Not wiser. But awake. Before, he had admired his parents because they were smart. Because they worked hard. Because they did good things. Now he understood them. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for people like him. People who didn't always see what was happening around them, until it happened to them. As their plane took off, he leaned against the window, watching the city disappear beneath the clouds. His father's words echoed in his mind. Anger is easy, but dignity stays. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of strength he wanted to have. 2. The world had shifted, not just for the Lambert family, but for everyone who had seen, heard, or felt the weight of that moment on the plane. A single confrontation had unraveled something deeper. Something woven into the fabric of everyday life but so often ignored. What had begun as an uncomfortable, fleeting encounter had become a story that would not be forgotten. The video had spread like wildfire. By the time Daniel, Elena, and Miles Lambert arrived at their hotel, the world had already taken notice. Their phones buzzed relentlessly, messages, calls, notifications flooding in from people they had never met. Some were from friends and colleagues, offering support and outrage on their behalf. Others were from strangers, people who had stumbled across the video online, who had seen the weight of the moment and felt it deep in their bones. I never thought about how this happens every day. I showed this video to my students today. We had a long conversation about unconscious bias. I used to think people exaggerated about these things. I was wrong. I see it now. Miles sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through comment after comment, his heart tight in his chest. He had never been part of something like this before, something that stretched beyond his own life, beyond his family, beyond anything he had ever imagined. His parents had always told him that their work was bigger than themselves. That every case his father fought, every lecture his mother gave, wasn't just about winning or teaching, it was about planting seeds. Now, for the first time, he truly understood what they meant. A shift in perspective. But it wasn't just the people watching online. The shift had begun the moment the plane landed. As they made their way through the airport, passengers who had remained silent on the flight approached them, some hesitant, others remorseful. A businessman in his 50s, the same one who had averted his gaze during the confrontation, stopped Daniel near the baggage claim. His voice was low, uncertain, but earnest. Mr. Lambert, I just wanted to say I respect how you handled that situation back there. I should have spoken up. I see that now. Daniel regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable before he simply nodded. It's never too late to do the right thing, he said. The man swallowed hard, nodded back, and walked away. It was a small moment, a quiet one, but Miles saw it for what it was. A crack in the armor of indifference. A shift, a seed planted. Further ahead, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, stepped forward hesitantly, her phone still in her hand from where she had been recording. I just wanted to thank you, she said, looking at Elena now. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with conviction. I was raised in a home where we were told these things didn't happen anymore. That racism was in the past. Watching what happened today, seeing the way you stood your ground, I can't unsee it. I don't want to unsee it. I want to do better. Elena reached out, gently touching the young woman's arm. A silent but powerful exchange. Then start today. The girl nodded, her eyes glassy with unshed tears, and whispered, thank you. The classroom and beyond. Back home, the impact stretched even further. At Elena's university, her students buzzed with conversation about what had happened. The video had reached them too. Some had shared it in group chats. Others had brought it up in class. One student, a young black woman with a thoughtful expression, raised her hand during discussion. "Professor Lambert, you always told us that dignity is the most powerful form of resistance. But how do you keep choosing dignity when the world keeps testing it?" Elena exhaled, her gaze sweeping across the room before she answered. "Because dignity isn't for them," she said softly. "It's for us. It's the one thing they can't take unless we let them." Her words settled over the class like a quiet storm, shaking them in ways that went beyond academia. Miles, too, carried the weight of the moment into his own world. At school, people had seen the video. Some whispered about it in the hallways. Some avoided the topic altogether. But his closest friends? They asked. They listened. They wanted to understand. "Did that really happen to you?" his best friend Leo asked. Eyes wide with disbelief. "Yeah," Miles said simply. "How did you not just lose it?" Miles thought of his father's words, of his mother's calm, of the way his parents had turned confrontation into conversation, ignorance into awareness. "Because losing it doesn't change anything," he said, "but making people see? That does." And Leo, who had never once had to think about these things before, nodded slowly. Because now, he saw the unseen impact. But the ripples extended even further. Beyond the classroom, beyond the news, beyond the people who supported them. Because somewhere, in her own world, Victoria Langley sat alone with the weight of what she had done. She had seen the video. She had read the comments. And for the first time, she saw herself through the eyes of others. Not as the composed, privileged woman she had always been, but as the villain of the story. And the realization crushed her. Her entire life, she had believed she was a good person, someone who never saw herself as part of the problem. But what if she had been wrong? The question wouldn't leave her. It clung to her, gnawed at her, unraveled her. And so, for the first time in her entire life, Victoria did something she had never done before. She listened. She sat in the discomfort. She didn't run from it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of her own transformation. A call to the listener. The Lambert family didn't set out to change the world. They simply stood their ground. And in doing so, they forced people to look in the mirror, some for the first time. Their story isn't just theirs. It belongs to every person who has ever been made to feel small. Every person who has ever been told they don't belong. And now, it belongs to you. So, what will you do with it? Will you be the person who stays silent when injustice happens right in front of you? Or will you be the voice that finally speaks up? Drop a comment below, because silence has never changed the world. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels screeching against the runway as it slowed to a halt. The journey that had started with so much anticipation and joy had taken a turn none of them had expected. But as Daniel Lambert, Elena, and their son Miles sat in their seats, preparing to step back into the real world, there was a sense that something had changed, not just in their own lives, but in the world they were stepping back into. Miles sat by the window, watching the city lights blur and the drizzle outside. It looked the same, but he felt different. This trip had taught him more than he could have ever learned in a classroom. More than any lecture or conversation had ever shown him. Before, he had always known his parents were extraordinary, not just because of their accomplishments, but because of the way they carried themselves. The way they moved through the world with quiet dignity, unwavering strength, and the unshakable belief that justice was worth fighting for. Now, for the first time, he understood what that really meant. He thought back to the moment on the plane when Victoria Langley had looked at them and decided, without hesitation, that they didn't belong. He had seen her certainty, the entitlement in her stance, the way she had spoken as if her mere presence gave her the authority to decide who was worthy of sitting in first class. But what had happened next was what mattered most. His parents hadn't yelled. They hadn't lashed out. They had simply stood their ground. With dignity, with grace, with truth. And that had been more powerful than any argument. Now, stepping off the plane, walking through the terminal, he could feel the weight of everything that had happened. The eyes on them, the whispers, the quiet nods of support. They weren't just another family coming home from vacation. They were part of a story now. A conversation, a movement. The video of the confrontation had continued to spread, reaching corners of the internet that had never seen them before. Some people defended Victoria, calling the family too sensitive, saying it was all a misunderstanding. But many more had seen the truth, had felt it in their bones. They had recognized the moment for what it was: a mirror. A reflection of something far too many had experienced. Far too often. And people were talking about it. Daniel checked his phone as they waited for their luggage. More messages. More emails. More articles dissecting the video. Analyzing the interaction. Breaking it down as a lesson in race, privilege, and quiet resistance. Mr. Lambert, I watched the way you handled that situation. And I just want to say, I've never thought about my own biases before. I think it's time I do. Elena, I'm a professor at a university in Texas. I'd love to invite you to speak to my students about your work on racial equity. These conversations need to happen. Miles, you are so lucky to have parents like yours. I hope you always carry yourself the way they do. Miles read the last one over Daniel's shoulder. His chest tightening. They were right. He was lucky. But more than that, he was inspired. Because now, he understood something he never had before. His parents weren't just reacting to the world. They were shaping it. And he wanted to do the same. Carrying the lesson forward. The days after their return were a blur of interviews, conversations, and reflection. The story refused to fade. It had become bigger than just one moment on a plane. It had become a symbol. A lesson in dignity. A challenge to the way people see the world. Elena stood in front of her class a few days later. The weight of the experience settling into her as she spoke to her students. What does it mean to belong? She asked. Scanning the room. A few students shifted in their seats. Who decides that? She continued. Silence. Then, a hand slowly rose. Society, a student said. The people in power. Elena nodded. And what happens when that power is questioned? When someone stands up and says, I belong here, too. A girl in the front row spoke up. People get uncomfortable. They push back. They try to prove you wrong. Exactly, Elena said. But here's the truth. Real belonging doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from knowing who you are. And refusing to let anyone tell you otherwise. She paused, looking around the room. And that is why dignity is the most powerful thing you will ever carry with you. Her students hung onto her words. The weight of them settling into their bones. This wasn't just a lesson. It was a challenge. A call to see the world differently. A new resolve. Meanwhile, Miles had his own moment of clarity. He had been assigned a history project, write about someone who inspired him. At first, he had thought of great leaders. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X. But then, he realized something. His greatest inspiration was right at home. So, he wrote about his parents. About the way his father had fought for justice in courtrooms. About the way his mother had shaped minds, changed perspectives, stood her ground. And about the way they had both, in that moment on the plane, shown him exactly what strength looked like. His teacher read his paper, then pulled him aside after class. Miles, this is powerful. Would you be willing to share this with the school? He hesitated. He had never liked being in the spotlight. But then he thought about his parents. About everything they had stood for, fought for, lived for. And he said, yes, because the world needed to hear these stories. A final thought. This isn't just a story about one family. This is bigger than them. This is about every person who has ever been told they don't belong. Every person who has ever walked into a room and felt the weight of unspoken doubt pressing against them. Every person who has had to prove themselves in spaces they should never have had to fight for. And to those people, this is for you. Know this. Your worth is not defined by the assumptions of others. Your dignity is your own. And the most powerful thing you can ever do is stand tall. Hold your ground, and never let the world tell you who you are. Now, we ask you, did this story resonate with you? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground? Even when the world tried to push you down? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, because conversations like these create change. And if you want more stories that challenge perspectives, inspire strength, and remind us all of what truly matters, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because this isn't just a story. This is a movement, and we're just getting started. Subscribe now to be part of the journey. Comment below to share your thoughts and show support. Like this post if you believe in the power of dignity and strength. Because together, we can change the conversation.